All right, so today we'll be breaking down the ER visits CARS passage. As the 70s have come to a close, a number of health services scholars have pointed out that the growing use of the hospital emergency room for the treatment of elective rather than urgent or emergent medical conditions has become a major issue in U.S. emergency room care. So, right off the bat, we're kind of getting a problem, and that is that we're seeing the treatment of elective rather than emergent or emergency conditions in U.S. hospital care. So, I'm going to highlight that because that might be important later. In point of fact, there's a substantial body of evidence that hospital emergency departments now see primarily non-urgent health problems, which might be more traditionally treated in a doctor's office. In Albert Roth's words, hospital emergency services handle largely routine walk-in cases. Urgent cases range from only 6 to 10% of total emergency department census. And Simone Roskies et al. Agrees that only a small percentage of ER visits are motivated by acute life-threatening illnesses. So the last couple sentences here are used to kind of support the author's argument about the ER being used for non-urgent care, and we see that with largely routine walk-in, and also only a small percentage of ER visits are motivated by acute life-threatening illnesses. In attempting to account for this extensive non-urgent use of the emergency room, a number of researchers have suggested that such use results from the scarcity of alternative treatment facilities. So this sentence is talking about maybe a suggestion for why these issues are going on, and it's setting it up to explain something else, and that is largely it's saying they're suggesting that this is caused by a scarcity of alternative treatment facilities. That is, some scholars have postulated that many persons who go to the emergency room to obtain treatment for routine health conditions do so because the emergency room is the only or is the most accessible healthcare facility available to them. A variety of findings from reports made throughout the 70s suggest that the hospital emergency department serves to make medical care available to persons who might otherwise have difficulty gaining access to healthcare providers. So this is more explaining that claim about the scarcity of alternative treatment facilities. So first we can see they might do so because the emergency room is the most accessible or the only healthcare facility available to them. And also, it seems to say it's serving to make medical care available to other people. So the author here is suggesting that researchers think maybe this is because the emergency room is the only accessible. This is a potential reasoning for why the problem is happening, essentially. Third paragraph. To investigate this idea, we drew data from the U.S. National Survey of Health Services Utilization Patterns conducted in 1971 by the Center for Health Administration Studies, CHAS, and the National Opinion Research Center, NORC, at the University of Chicago. The number of individuals included in the survey was 11,619. So I think this first couple of sentences are really important here because it's explaining that the author is actually investigating these researchers' suggestions and seeing if accessibility is really the reason why people aren't going to the ER for acute, and they're going for non-acute injuries or illnesses. And it's kind of just explaining the data here. The CHAS-NORC data are especially well suited for the present investigation for several reasons. First, these national data explicitly assess healthcare services utilization. Second, the CHAS-NORC sample has provided the basis for a number of widely cited studies of health services utilization, and by using these data, we provide continuity with past researchers. So essentially, the last two sentences of this paragraph are just explaining why they use the data and qualifying it as good data, because it explicitly assesses healthcare services utilization, and a number of widely cited studies have used it, especially within health services utilization, and they're doing that to provide continuity with past research. Our findings suggest little support for the off claim that much of the emergency room use results from the lack of access to alternative sources of treatment. This is a big sentence. Basically, it's saying that the author has determined that the previous claim about accessibility is not true. So it's kind of providing a counter argument to what people initially are saying. So little support is important, that the use results from the lack of access to alternative treatments. Furthermore, these findings hold up regardless of whether one considers the correlation between an individual's ER visits and his visits to other health providers, or rather examines mean visits among categories of three important explanatory value variables. So it's also explaining here with explanatory variables that even when you consider other things that might affect it, such as going to another doctor, or the frequency of going to other doctors versus just going to the ER, there's really no correlation between them. And so accessibility is kind of just providing further support to the idea that it's not caused by an accessibility issue. So like thieves finding hold up regardless are important, or also the correlation between ER visits and to other healthcare providers might be important later when we're answering the questions. Nor has there been a growing boom of building alternate care facilities between 1971 and now. So the findings are not outdated. Again, just qualifying the findings and saying that it's not outdated because there's been no real change in the amount of accessibility to things, to healthcare. Consequently, researchers attempting to explain the extensive non-urgent care use in the emergency room might be advised to consider explanatory schemes other than those stressing differences in accessibility between emergency rooms and other facilities. So the author's making a claim here that researchers attempting to explain why emergency rooms are being used for the wrong reasons, they should explore ideas other than differences in accessibility between emergency rooms and other facilities. All right, our last one: ruling out trips to the ER due to lack of other facilities opens up room for investigating other reasons many people go into the ER. For example, one factor which has received relatively little attention in the emergency room literature is the extent to which physicians refer their patients to the emergency room. So here the author is offering another reason behind why we might be seeing these increased amounts of non-urgent care use of the ER. And so important here is to the extent which physicians refer their patients to the emergency room. This is the alternate idea, and it's received little attention. And other reasons I like to highlight, because so we have our other reasons, and it's saying our other reasons might be the extent to which physicians refer their patients to the emergency room. Several recent commentators have observed that emergency rooms often obtain non-urgent cases through physician referrals rather than via patient self-initiated visits. So this is really important because it's giving some credence to the idea that it's the physicians referring, not necessarily an issue of accessibility, because they have observed that often obtain non-urgent care patients through referrals rather than patients self-initiated visits. Additional analysis of referral patterns indicate that referred patients often return later to their original doctor for follow-up care or a subsequent health problem. Clearly, such patients are not entirely substituting emergency room care for that of an office-based physician, but rather merely utilizing the ER as an auxiliary provider source in addition to their regular doctor. So this last two sentences are really just providing more support to the fact that it's not accessibility, because the patients that are going from their doctor to the ER are not using the ER as a long-term source of care, and it's not that it's not an access-based thing. It's that they're going because of provider provider referrals. So I think important here is not entirely substituting emergency care, um, but rather are merely utilizing the ER as an auxiliary provider source in addition to the regular doctor. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's our breakdown. Question 1. To answer which of the following questions would be most useful in determining the validity of the author's assessment of why patients visit the emergency room? So basically, this question is just asking us what could we learn more about to make sure that the author assessment is true about why patients are going to the emergency room. So first we have to think about what is that assessment, and that assessment is that they're going not because of accessibility reasons, as other researchers suggest, but actually because maybe because of doctor referrals. So option A, how many patients per day does the average emergency room see? This is kind of answering about not why patients are going to the emergency room, just how many. So I think we can eliminate that. Option B, what kinds of services does a typical emergency room offer? Again, this is not really answering that why question. It's more about what the services offer. And we also know that from the passage that they offer urgent and non-urgent care because non-urgent care is a problem that they are treating. So we can eliminate that. Option C, why do patients follow doctor referrals when going to the emergency room? This is a possible option because it's talking about the doctor referrals that the author is supporting, but it's asking why do patients follow the doctor referrals, not really why the referrals are happening in the first place, or kind of getting to that root cause of why the patients are visiting the emergency room. So it's a possible option, but I'm not entirely sure. Option D, why would doctors give patients referrals to the emergency rooms? I think this is our best answer because it's getting to kind of the root cause. Why are these extra referrals that are causing more people to go to there? And that's better than just why are the patients causing the referrals, or why are patients following doctors' referrals? Because it's getting more to the root cause rather than an intermediate cause in the problem of people going to the emergency room for non-acute services. So let's check with D, and it's question 2. According to the first paragraph of the passage, emergency rooms blank. A, emergency rooms do not resemble a normal doctor's office. Is this supported in the passage? I'm not entirely sure, especially with the idea that they're treating non-urgent conditions, especially non-urgent conditions here we see that can be treated at a doctor's office. So it might somewhat resemble a doctor's office, but I don't really think it's making the claim that they don't resemble a doctor's office. So we can remove that option. B, are becoming increasingly overcrowded. It does talk about that there's not really the right use of the emergency services, but it's not really talking about the fact that the emergency services are being stretched thin or anything like that. So I don't think overcrowded is the right option here. C, are expected to treat pressing health issues. I think the paragraph does support this because it's suggesting that it's an issue that most of the cases that they're handling are not actually pressing health issues, and if that is a problem, that's probably means that they are expected to treat the pressing issues in general rather than just the urgent cases and the non-urgent cases. And then D, avoid treating elective medical conditions. The paragraph actually says the opposite. It's saying that they pointed out the growing use of the hospital emergency room for treatment of elective right there in our paragraph. So we can say that that's not the answer and that C is the correct answer. C, and it's correct.